Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jillian Robinson. I'm Director of ARK, which is a joint resource with Queen's University and the University of Ulster. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this seminar as part of the 2008-2009 seminar series. ARK's mission is about opening up access to social and political information, particularly on Northern Ireland. But in our seminar series this year, we have introduced some speakers from outside Northern Ireland who are working on areas of interest to us within Northern Ireland. And we're particularly delighted that Professor Bogusia, sorry, I'm notorious for not saying things properly, Bogusia Temple from the University of Central Lancashire has agreed to come and share with us some of the findings from her research, which has been going on for a good number of years now with the Polish community. And the format is that Bogusia will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for some comments, discussion, reflection, and after that then there'll be a light lunch served outside where you're welcome to join us and continue the conversations. So if everyone's happy with that, I'll just ask Bogusia to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you first for inviting me to come and talk to you. I've been really looking forward to it. I know very little about the Northern Ireland context, so I hope it's going to be sort of joint conversation. You can tell me a bit about what's going on in Ireland and I'll tell you a bit about England. I've been interested in Polish communities since the 1980s. So my research goes back a long way, much of it unfunded because there weren't very many people interested in funding research with Polish people in the 1980s. But recently I've had funding from Joseph Rowntree and the project I'm going to be talking about today from the ESRC. The Joseph Rowntree one was about interpreters, working with interpreters, and looked at issues of trust in interpretation. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but I will be trying to make a mix of sort of academic background, a substantial amount on the findings, and then a little bit on the policy implications. So I'm hoping there's going to be a bit in this for everybody. I was just saying earlier that this is the first time I've presented the actual findings of it. I found people have been very interested in the methodology and how I did it. So I'm now interested in what people make of the findings. I can see that. Is that too dark? Too dark? Oh.
Do you need a bit
dark?
That's fairly bright, you know.
That is that? Right. Okay. Right. I'm from the University of Central Lancashire, which is in Preston, in northern England. But my research, the one I'm going to be talking about today, is from Manchester. My previous research has been with communities around England, and also I've collected oral histories with Polish people from around the world and analysed them in various ways. There are two bits to this ESRC research project. The first one is concerned with developing the methodology around working with people who speak different languages. And what I was interested in was that a lot of researchers using qualitative methods, and particularly researchers using biographical methods, talk about the importance of being reflective, thinking about who the researcher is and what the researcher's position is. But it's very interesting that when different languages are considered, when we do research with people who don't speak English, that sort of reflexivity is really pushed to one side, and quite often data from interviews and biographical accounts are just given to translators to translate, and then a final very tidy product is reproduced for the research. So I was interested in looking at how we would look at some of the issues in thinking about the translator's position in the research. But there were also very specific substantive content to this, because this was a time in England where we had large numbers of Polish migrants coming that were in the press. It seemed like almost every day they're coming, they're swamping us, they're taking our services. So there was a range of questions, and I won't be able to talk about all of these today. I'll just pick a few. So I was interested in how language, Polish and English languages, were used in Polish migrants' lives. There was a big debate about the cost of translation and interpretation services and why people didn't learn English. Some people who'd been in England since the Second World War and still couldn't speak good English. I was also interested in participants' views of integration and the role of English in their lives, and how important the Polish language was for passing on ideas of being Polish and Polish traditions, and who was responsible for this. So there was a sort of gender aspect to this as well. And another question that I was interested in was, were there differences within the community about what being Polish entailed and the importance of passing on the Polish language and Polish traditions? And on a sort of practical level, how do people who know very little of English learn English when they come to England, and what are the obstacles to this? So the provision of ESOL, for example, classes. Right, the method was interviewed 30 people in the Polish community in Greater Manchester. I should stress it's Greater Manchester, it's not Manchester, so you won't be able to identify this. There are at least 10 different locations for Polish communities around the Greater Manchester area, and I've changed all the names of quotes and taken out anything that I can identify people. And I've tried to look across a range of different people who describe themselves Polish in different ways. So I've talked to people who have come to England immediately after the Second World War. I've talked to people who would describe as the Solidarność generation, who came for political reasons, people who came to marry, as well as some recent economic migrants. And they were interviewed in the language of their choice. Mostly this was Polish, but occasionally it was English, because some recent migrants wanted to show that they could carry on quite a sophisticated conversation in English. And we had discussions, the research assistant, Katarzyna Koterba, and I had discussions over the translation process. So I'll just go on now to talk a bit about the background, why I was interested in looking at language. I came across the work of Spivak, who talks about translation being, it's more than a description of the world. It's about using rhetoric and logic to persuade people of a particular account. And also was looking at the work of Venuti, who talks about domestication and foreignization, that translators have to make decisions about how much they're going to tidy up the accounts that they hear. And he argues that we should go for a bit of foreignization, that it does matter which language that you speak, and people present themselves differently in different languages, and some of those issues should come across in your interviews. Otherwise, we all sound as if we speak perfect BBC English when it comes down to the final report. So they're talking about a politics and an ethics of how you represent other people in your research. So I've got a quote from Spivak here, and she describes the process of most translation, and I would say most research, as a process of translatees, where it doesn't matter where you come from, you all sound the same at the end. You all sound as if you speak English perfectly. So she says that the literature of the Third World gets translated into a sort of translatees, so that literature of a woman in Palestine begins to resemble, in the feel of its prose, something by a man in Taiwan. So all the language differences just vanish. So I've used in my research, and I've written this up in various places, so I don't want to talk too much about it today. I've used the biographical approaches to looking at the position of interpreters and translators within research processes. I've used the concept of intellectual autobiography, looking at how the researcher affects the research and how the participants affect the research, but also how do translators and interpreters affect the research. I'm not saying this is the only way of doing it. I'm saying it's one approach to opening up research with people who come from a variety of backgrounds. There are other approaches that I've looked at in my work. And I look at ideas of translation memories, how translators use their background and their experiences within communities to translate and to interpret from a position. So I'm interested in the whole of how do you represent people who have spoken in research in a language that they're not written up in the end. And I came across the work of Pavlenko, and she writes about, I think she's a sociolinguist, but she writes a lot about being bilingual and being multilingual. And in effect, that is what community researchers are. That's what you employ them for, is because of their ability to communicate in different languages with people that you're working with. And she has done a lot of work about the importance of which language it is that you speak in, that we present differently in different languages. We have different emotional repertoires, she calls them, different ways of expressing ourselves, different ways of looking at humour. And we make choices about how to present ourselves in the different languages. And this is a very complicated quote for saying something that Eva Hoffman has said quite succinctly, really. Eva Hoffman is, well, she's written what could be described as autobiographies, but you can take them at any level. They can be philosophical discussion. There's quite a lot of philosophical debate about being Polish in it, but it's also about her story of coming to Poland, going to Canada, and then moving to America and having to translate herself. It's not just a case of translating words and concepts. It's translating how she expresses herself and how she lives into a variety of different languages. And she says, I know that I've been written in a variety of languages, because she had to learn how to write in English when before she'd written in Polish. So to move on, that's a quick run through my sort of interest in why it's important to look at the languages people speak. And I have written this up elsewhere. If anybody wants to know, I'll give you the details of it. But I now want to move on to the findings for the research. And one of the questions I asked people was what being Polish meant for them. And everybody described how important being Polish was. But it wasn't an either or, I'm Polish and I'm not something else. People described how in different circumstances they described themselves in different ways. So they would be Polish, they would be British, they would be European. It didn't mean that one excluded the other. In particular circumstances, they described themselves in a different way. And I do the same thing. I'm from a Polish background, I'm Polish, I'm English, I'm European. I don't care sometimes. I don't think it makes a difference. So they're all the kinds of issues that I was looking at. But when they were talking about being Polish, they mentioned a range of things that were important. And one of them was being, whether it was important to be Catholic or not, whether that was important to being Polish. And for everybody, bar one, I think it was, but not in the sense of having a spiritual belief in something. It was a way of keeping in touch with the community. And there was one woman in particular who struck me in her description of why she belonged to the Polish Catholic community. She described herself as a practicing non-believer. So she went to church not because she wanted a particular kind of Catholicism. She wanted a spiritual message, sort of in the wider sense of she wanted to belong to a community, to speak the language of that community. And this was a very good place of meeting other Polish people. And there was one man from a Jewish background who described how Polish people, he thought Polish people were all culturally Catholic, if they weren't actually Catholic. It was a way of mixing with other people. So being Catholic was important, but not quite in the way that I'd expected. There was only one person that said that they thought being born in Poland was actually essential to being Polish. You didn't have to be born in Poland. You could be born in England and speak Polish and want to belong to a Polish community, and that was still being Polish. They all agreed unanimously that the Polish language was crucial, that you couldn't not speak Polish and understand what was going on in the community. So that's the issue I'm going to focus on for the rest of the findings, because it has implications for policies around integration and community cohesion, which I'll refer to a bit later in my talk. And I think it's summed up very well. This is Bożena Stanczyk, who is a student and had been here for a number of years. And she said, jeżeli ja nie mam języka, ja nie istnieję, istnieję tylko dla siebie. So if I don't have the language, I don't exist. I do exist, but only for myself. So you have to speak the language to be part of something. And to be part of a Polish community, even if wherever you were born in the world, you have to know the language. And they also recognised that being Polish was in some ways different to being English. The way they expressed themselves were different. The way that they saw themselves was different. So I've got a quote here by Marta, who was an accountant. And she said, I can express myself in both languages. You have to be careful about the intonation, about the way you say that, your mimic. The mimic bit was said in English. I think that you can't actually express in English the full meaning of your emotions. And Eva Kowalska stated that she would never marry an Englishman because there will always be a part of my personality that they will never understand. So they related being Polish to Polish language and to expressing themselves differently and I'll describe a bit later, behaving differently. So language was important for them as a way of identifying themselves and as a way of identifying other Polish people who felt the same way. And when we talked about how they saw other communities, we talked about particularly about English communities, but also there was a lot of discussion about people from Pakistan and from Pakistani background and about their values. And they used the language that people spoke to make assumptions about how they were likely to behave. So these are some of the most extreme comments because they sort of stick in my mind, but there were a variety of these. So Beale, he was a migrant, said about the people that he'd met since he came to England, as there is all the time shagging, and he used that word in English, boozing, drinking and parties. So I think some of these ideas had been picked up by what they'd seen on the streets, and there's a document, Our Shared Future, I think, in England, that talks about, there's been very little research done on the effects of behaviour, excess drinking and violence on the streets and antisocial behaviour on community cohesion and integration. And one of the things our research found was that a lot of Polish migrants in particular were feeling unsafe on the streets, and they were identifying that form of behaviour with English values. So another migrant said, the dirt on their streets reflects their way of upbringing, their culture. They are wild and spoiled, whereas Polish people are more disciplined. And there's another comment, I've seen that lives take place in pubs. So there was a lot of fears about safety and a desire to hold on to what they thought were more traditional values around the importance of family, hard work, not drinking too much. So I'm not saying that different languages are tied to different values anyway, but that people were looking, were seeing what they saw on the streets and tying it to these particular sets of values. On the other hand, there were a whole lot of comments about how positive some of the English values were that they'd seen since they came here. And these tended to be around the possibility of getting on in this country and being rewarded for hard work and developing individual careers, opportunities and freedom was seen as a big positive. And one of the reasons that they'd come here was actually that if you put the hard work in, you were more likely to be rewarded. And one of the comments that I've pulled out here was from a Polish migrant who had left Poland exactly because he wanted to come to England because of those kinds of reasons. He felt that life was a lot closer, a lot more confined in Poland, particularly because, and one of the things he talked about was about the influence of the Catholic Church. And he'd come with his girlfriend, and they had no desire to get married. As he said, they had no need of a certificate, and they didn't want to have children, and they thought that that was, from where they came in Poland, that was quite a difficult position to live in. So he said, I think that we have pulled ourselves out of the Polish yoke. The fact that we are in England helps us to be anonymous. So they were very positive about if they brought their families here and worked hard, there would be some reward for this. So they used the associated different languages and hearing people speak with what they were likely to believe and what values were important to them. But it's actually not as simple as that even, because they differentiated within the community around what people were what people's values were, and the kind of Polish that they used was used to signal likely differences in values. So I won't read out this because it's a very long-winded way of Bogusia saying that the way you speak, the way you pronounce things, actually signifies a whole set of social characteristics. It signals to people who are listening information about your background that you may not be aware of. And I think he's not writing about any specific language. He's talking about pronunciation and grammar and diction and all those kinds of things. But it became clear that when we interviewed people in Polish, that they were making the same kinds of distinctions within Polish communities and amongst Polish speakers. So one second-generation man described how he thought we were of the same community, but we're not. Just because we speak Polish doesn't mean that we're all the same and we all see the world in the same way. And some of the divisions were around the economic migrants who had come recently to England. So one woman who'd come after the Second World War said, they come, why, what for? If you came for political reasons, if you came after the Second World War, or if you came because you had been scared for your life under the communist regime, then that was fine. But if you just came to make money, then that wasn't an authentic reason for coming to England. So this second-generation man said, you can analyse they can analyse who's being polite, what background they come from. So they said that Polish speakers made an assumption about you once they listened to your Polish. And he described how young Polish migrants were sniggering and correcting his, that's a second generation kind of Polish, friends Polish. And the Polish people who come in the 70s, that's the Solidarność generation, were good quality people, because those people who came over, they came over for political reasons, whereas these people are coming now. They should stay in Poland and build up their own country. So the importance of... oh, sorry, I've just lost it. Right. The importance of changing of values when you move to another country for migrants has been recognised for a long time. Going back to Thomas and Staniecki's, the Polish peasant in Europe and America, recognised that when you move from one context to another, that values can be important, and you have to change. As I said, you're translating your life into a different culture rather than just translating words. So people in the Polish community talked about young migrants becoming more English as they came here. The young migrants themselves were talking about well, it's not as simple as that, because Poland wasn't like that anyway. A lot of these people left when they were young, and they've got a very romantic idea of what Poland was like, and Poland itself has changed. So there were tensions about what being Polish was and who was allowed to say what was Polish, who spoke for the community, if you like. And I think they're very interesting issues for people doing research with Polish communities, because where you go to may actually influence what kind of findings you get. If you go to the Polish community, the formal Polish organisations, you may get particular kinds of views. If you go to people who go to pubs in Manchester who don't frequent the community facilities, you will get a different view. Polish people in Manchester have set up their own sort of alternative entertainment, if you like. So they have Polish evenings in pubs and clubs around Manchester. So where you go for your sample, it can be very important. And people recognise that this was, even within the communities that I talked to, this was about defining who could be Polish. So this is Paweł, who's second generation. His parents both came from Poland. And he said, we don't feel perhaps as special as we used to be because of the influx in the UK, where there are a lot of Poles and there are some reserves about among English people. In some areas they are taking our jobs and so on. So there were tensions about, again, why you came here and why you wanted to stay. And this is an older woman who came after the Second World War, and she still spoke very little English. And she said, Polish people have changed so much they consider us, that's the older Polonia, the people that came after the war, living here as English. It hurts. That's when people called her English. She felt she was still Polish, just because she spent most of her life in England. She didn't see herself as English. So looking at the sort of influences on who people mix with, that we found that was unsurprisingly related to the level of English that they spoke. So Eva Milnarczyk, who was the woman who said that it hurt when people called her English, said she recognised that she only had Polish friends, and she only had Polish friends because she didn't speak English, so it was very difficult to socialise. And she said, maybe therefore I can't speak good English because everything was only with Polish people, But there were people who could speak speak English very well, but who still thought that the kind of English that they spoke influenced the kind of people that they could mix it with. They thought that their English wasn't good enough to mix with the kind of people that they wanted to mix with. So this is a Polish migrant, and excuse me, he said, but when we talk to English people, we talk about, excuse my language, about not important things. Now, when I read this, I thought, excuse my language, not important things, that sounds fine to me. This is an example of some of the translation issues. The research assistant, Katarzyna, thought it was a bit rude to actually put in the words that had been used. When I read it through, I changed it to trivia, and then I thought about it some more, and I thought, well, actually, it was a bit stronger than trivia. It was Mary's ass, it was rubbish, it was the dregs. You could talk about the weather, whether the food in the restaurant was nice, but not anything particularly significant. And he felt he wanted to integrate, he wanted to talk to people, but he found it very frustrating that he couldn't actually talk about the issues that he wanted to talk about, and that possibly meant he had to live in England a long time before he could begin to develop the kind of friendships and express himself in the kind of ways that he wanted to. On the other side, of course, was the migrant Beale, who didn't want to make any effort to integrate because of his views about English values. He'd come here to earn money and to go back, and that was all there was to it. What's the point? So even within recent arrivals, there's a whole range of reasons why they come, and whether it's worth their while actually investing in learning in English. If they intend to stay longer term, it might be. If they just want to have a good income for a short period, send money back to Poland, it doesn't make much sense really to invest and to pay for English language lessons. So this is a quote from Houston et al., who have done some work in Northern Ireland around migration, who say, "We propose that it's not a simple matter of sharing a space, whether residential, occupational or educational. What matters is if there's any meaningful cross-group contact." So whether people want to integrate or whether communities want to get to know each other better isn't a simple fact around whether the sort of language that they speak. There's lots of other influences going on. And I'm going to describe briefly some of the kinds of networks people had to show the different ways in which they interacted with people from different communities. At the one extreme is the example I've already given of Eva Melantric, who talked about only mixing with Polish people, only saying hello, how are you, over the fence and nothing else. She'd been here since the Second World War. And these I've described as Polish networks. And there's some work recently on migrants by Spencer for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that shows that there are, from people who have come more recently, there are a large percentage of them, even over a number of years, who still don't speak very much to English speakers. An alternative kind of network is what I've called the limited choice network, which is the example of the man who said that he found it frustrating because of the kind of English he spoke didn't allow him to mix with the kind of people that he wanted to mix with. And that he recognised that he could be here 10 years before he could sort of speak the kind of English he wanted to speak. There were also, we found people, I've put them under the category of divided networks. And these weren't, you might think that these were just second generation people whose parents had come after the war, who had been born in England, who tended to separate out their Polish and their English friends. We had examples of that, but there were also a group of more recent migrants who felt that their English friends and the Polish friends were very different, and they wouldn't necessarily get on, and they'd made a decision to keep them separate. To see both of them, both groups were important, but they weren't sure whether they'd actually get on. And at the other extreme from the Polish networks, the final one I've been looking at is mixed networks. So there were a couple of, I think they were both women, who had made a conscious decision that they wanted to mix with both English and Polish people socially at the same time. That was part of the reason for coming to England, was to have the experience as well as benefit from the job. So they'd made a conscious effort to try and integrate as much as possible, and to mix their friends, and they found it a very positive experience. But for all of these groups, the networks that they have were transnational. They weren't just within England. They quite often sent money back to Poland. They earned property in Poland. And we had examples of some people who had come 2 or 3 times already to England, gone back for a couple of years, then come back again. So it was a different kind of migration to the migration after the Second World War. They had more choice about whether they could go backwards and forwards, where they settled. And there's a Channel 4 programme described it recently as a form of short-term business trips, rather than a more traditional form of migration. So I just want to say a bit about the area of community cohesion here, and the government's drive to community cohesion. We found there were differences within communities about whether they wanted to mix with people who spoke different languages and had different backgrounds, and I think I've already given you a range of some of the kinds of differences there were. They also made assumptions about values of other people, and the work that I mentioned by Spencer has pointed out that many of the migrants that she spoke to had been unaware just how multicultural England was. And that it had taken some adjusting when they arrived. There was also a difference in how important people thought things like the Polish language or keeping them separate or keeping values separate was, how important it was for their sense of self. So that influenced who they were prepared to mix with. And there's been a very interesting debate in the Catholic Tribune, I think it is, about the effect of the Polish Catholic mission. Because in England, they're quite distinct Polish communities. They have Polish priests, Polish churches, and you can actually be Catholic and have very little to do with other Catholic people in England. So then, you know, how does this fit in with ideas of integration and community cohesion, if even in religious reasons you can keep yourself separate? There were also differences about whether the kinds of people wanted to mix with along the lines of how long they wanted to stay. So some people had already made their mind up that this was a short visit. They'd earn as much as they could, take the money back and buy some property or use it to invest for their children's future. But other people had decided that they wanted to make England their home, and that therefore there was some sense in investing in learning the language, even if it involved paying for English language classes, which the general view was, while very useful, tended to be oversubscribed. They couldn't afford the cost of them, and at inconvenient times, so there was a problem about attending them. There was also, excuse me, an issue about citizenship, as we asked about citizenship. And whether it was necessary to apply for British citizenship when you could come and go as you wanted anyway. You know, in a sense, you were a European citizen already, so there had to be some other reason for wanting to be a British citizen. And they all recognised the importance and the tensions around social and economic environment. When jobs are scarce, the tensions between communities tend to rise, and we already had some comments about scarcity of jobs and people telling them to go home, and examples of racial harassment. So in terms of community cohesion, there are implications here for the kind of short-term business trips and citizenship policies if migration has changed and people really can't see the point. And they've no need to make a decision instantly about whether they're going to stay or not stay. It's sort of, one man described it as a sort of railway track where you laid sleepers in little bits over time, and you suddenly realised that you had more sleepers in England than you had in Poland, and that sort of made the decision for you. So it wasn't a, oh, I'm going to stay or I'm not going to stay. It sort of crept up on you. And in some ways that's similar to what happened to the older generation in Poland, that when it was time, when they could go back after the Iron Curtain came down, they didn't want to, because their lives are here, the children are here, they've built up businesses, and they had laid their sleepers since the Second World War. So there are also effects, as I've said, on for the current economic crisis about British jobs for British people. And there is evidence, this is after my research finished, when I talk to Polish people now about hearing these comments more often, and the tensions that's likely to have in the long run. So I'd just like to thank Katarzyna, who taught me a lot about recent Polish, and bought me a slang dictionary. Because as you may have gathered, my background is, my parents are from Poland, so my Polish is a very formal very proper kind of textbook Polish. So I found some of the interviews actually quite difficult to do because at some points I couldn't recognise that this was the Polish that I'd been brought up with. And on the other side, there was Katarzyna, who found some of the second generation throwing in English words, sort of form of Ponglish, she called it, difficult to understand. So we had some quite interesting discussions about what people meant when they said things in the interviews and how language had changed. And I'd like to thank the participants who spent quite a lot of time talking to us about this research, and we've published in a Polish newspaper some of the results of this. And we continue to talk to people about it. And what I'm interested in now is what effects the current economic crisis has on being Polish, and whether it's likely to influence whether you go back to Poland or not. So thank you very much for listening. No, I think I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really very interesting findings from some of your studies. I'm sure some people here, I know some people here are working with the Polish community in Northern Ireland and may have some questions, or other people studying and looking at minority ethnic groups in general in Northern Ireland. So if you'd like to make any comments, observations or reflections, feel free. And sorry, we are recording the seminar, so if you have a question, if you just wait and speak into the mic, it doesn't magnify, it's just for the purposes of the video. Okay. So do we have any thoughts or observations?
Just in relation to the methodology in your research, I'm wondering, future research, is it good to have a Polish translator? Because, as you said, some things can be lost in translation. And I'm even thinking the point of view from migrant workers coming here, and if they have to access services, then there's a translator in place. And how beneficial is, as a translator?
Well, I like to work with translators because obviously I'm interested in the Polish language and how people use it and what it means for what they are. But I also feel that sometimes it's good to have an outsider's view of it. So you don't necessarily, if somebody wants to speak English, and we had an instance of that in the interview, then let them speak English. You don't need a Polish interpreter. I think that people say different things if they think that you're from a Polish background. So I have examples on all of my interviews from the 80s. People say things to me like, well, you know, don't you? And they don't explain it any further. So on some occasions, it's actually quite useful to have somebody who isn't from that background, and you can have a completely different view of it. So I tend to go with what people prefer, I think, rather than say, I will always speak Polish and that is the best way of doing it, because I don't think necessarily it is. They just tell you different things, I think, and maybe on some occasions they actually explain a bit more to you if they don't think you're from that background. So it depends on the purpose that you're going for.
I use the opportunity because I have the mic here, so I do actually have a question. What I'm interested in, when you were talking about the integration of the Polish community in English society, when they were talking about it in the interviews, were they talking about integration as an English, white English society? Because English society is very diverse. There are the Pakistanis, there are the Indians, and so on. So, what were your findings in relation to like a multinational, multicultural integration in English society? How were they relating to other minorities living in England?
Yes. When they generally started talking about the English, and when we talked about it in more detail, what they actually recognised was there isn't such a thing as the English. And then you'd have to talk in a bit more detail about which group of people they were talking about. So they were talking about a diverse range of communities. And as I said before, I think part of some of the negative comments was around the fact that some people had found it as quite a shock that England was so diverse. So they would, occasionally they were very broad comments, but sometimes they would detail specific examples. For example, we had comments about children who had been sent to schools where there were large groups of people from a Pakistani background. So we had comments about those communities. So sometimes they singled out groups and sometimes it was a general they that they referred to. If that answers your question.
Yeah, they were not particularly derogatory. No, I'm just looking
no,
about the...
No, they weren't.
Looking for the status, how the Polish community, in terms of the status, perceives themselves in English society in relation to other minorities.
Yes. No, they weren't necessarily derogatory. Some were. So, some of the views that are in this research could be described as quite racist, about not wanting to send your children to schools with large proportions of Pakistani children, for example. But on the other side of it, I think there were more comments about what children would learn from that kind of experience, and a sort of recognition that some of the other minority communities, for example, such as the Pakistani communities, had very traditional family values and values that they could relate to. So they did differentiate between the communities, and not always in a negative way. And for some of the people, it was the reason they'd come to England, was that that was an experience that they'd wanted.
Any other points?
I would like to ask if during your interviews, have you also encountered a kind of decision, a conscious decision of Polish people to convert? Because we have, in our project, we have gathered some interviews and we see that the type of networks people build and the type of relationships they decide to build, the type of strategies they develop may be really affected by the decisions they make about their identities. So, and we have examples of people who leave Poland and they really want to leave, like they want to forget about the background and to make conversion, like full conversion. So they are going to speak English only, and they are going to have only English friends, and they are going to have an English boyfriend, English girlfriend. They are going to speak English only to their children. Have you encountered such examples as well?
No, the nearest I came to it was the man who was talking about he wanted to get away from the Polish yoke. I think that is the nearest we came to that kind of view, and I've heard that view expressed outside of the research, that people they come here, and that's why they come here, because they want to get away from the sort of lifestyle that they had in Poland. So that man still described himself as Polish, but he didn't see all these lifestyle issues as relevant to him. I don't know what will happen to him in the longer term. It would be interesting, but it was interesting because his English was already very good, so he could make that decision. You know, he could make a sort of quite a quick move into taking part in his neighbourhood and picking the kinds of people he wanted to mix with. So it wouldn't be from the Polish church or necessarily Polish people at all. It would be the kind of people he wanted to know. And he described himself, he was the one man who was quite strong about having a European identity as well. He was Polish, he acknowledged he was Polish, but it was equally important to him to be European, and as he described it, as a man of the world. You know, and we had quite an interesting conversation in the interview about why did it matter at some point? Did it matter what you described yourself as? So I can see that, you know, if we'd spoken to more people, that view might have come out more.
Just one more thing. It's interesting what you just said about European identity, because we are researching that here. But in the interviews I've made here in Northern Ireland with Polish people, it does not appear. There are just two reference points. One is Poland and one is Northern Ireland. And they are Polish, like strongly Polish living here, but the context of Europe as such just does not appear at all here. As far. I think
I had to ask, I've learnt, because I was saying I've been doing this since the 80s, to phrase the question so that it isn't, are you Polish or not? It's how do you see your background and how do you see yourself? And that isn't sort of just in terms of ethnicity. And that's when you get the sort of wider comments about, well, we're talking about being Polish, but that might not necessarily be that important. Sometimes it just doesn't matter.
Hi, my name's Edel Murphy. I'm from the Arts Council. And part of my remit within the community arts is ethnic minorities. I just wanted to ask you, had you any feedback in terms of the relevance of the arts that are indigenous to UK and the perceived barriers to accessing or expressing yourself through the arts within a community like the Polish community?
I think in relation to the arts, we had a whole section of these interviews about traditions and passing on traditions, and within those debates there was a strong recognition of the importance of Polish music. Polish dancing came out as particularly important, and Polish singing. And interesting, Polish food was a big issue, a big part of being Polish. I think some of the barriers are actually around some of the things I've talked about, around the tensions within communities and not wanting to open that up to other people to see, actually. So there would be dancing groups and singing groups and whatever, but they tended to be located within particular communities, formal communities, on community premises. So there would be groups of people who didn't want to go to those kinds of venues, and then they would find it a problem about where to set up, because they weren't aware of where to go for funding and how to keep it going. But I've got examples of a film club that's been set up by recent migrants, and they meet regularly and discuss Polish films. So they have, on a small scale, sort of begun to investigate. And I think as they live here longer, they will become more used to, you know, where do you go for funding? Where can we set up? How can we recruit people? But I think it's still quite new.
I'm just wondering, from what you're saying, it seems it's like, in some readings I've been looking at, it's about acculturation, where people assimilate to new cultures. And because of that, have you seen any problems coming out of the Polish community because of this acculturation, especially with more recent migrants?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is they don't want to assimilate. They see it as a two-way process. They want to be part of something, but they offer something in return for it. They offer, and the thing that they kept coming up with was how hard Polish people work, and that sort of the culture of giving something in return, working hard. So, sorry, I was so determined to make my point, I lost the end of your question.
I'm just wondering, you know, this process of acculturation.
Oh, yes.
And can there be problems? And you were mentioning that maybe they don't want to acculturate or assimilate.
Yes, I think it's what I was saying before about not being aware of how multicultural England is before they come. And I know that there are moves from people like, I think, the British Council and from universities in Poland to sort of put on talks for students about what coming to England involves and what you should expect and what your rights are and what your responsibilities are. So I think that helps that. But I think from the examples of people that we've got who come to earn money and that's all they want to do, they don't want to be integrated or part of the culture or anything. It's just, like they said, it's a short-term business trip. So for some, there are some things you can do for some people who want to stay here longer term and be a part of what's going on in Great Britain, but there are other groups who will not want it. And as you could say that's the same for the older generation as well. There were groups there, for example, the woman that I told you about, Eva, who just didn't want it, and it wouldn't matter what you did to try and get her to be part of society. She wasn't interested. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
I found it really interesting, the division into networks that you presented, and I was wondering if you encountered many people who were actually in none of these networks, who went only into the local society, who just cut their ties with the Polish community and went straight to English. Because I know in England there is this division, or maybe sometimes conflict, between the old migration and Polish migration and the new one. In Northern Ireland there were probably about 30 Polish people living before Poland joined the European Union, so there's not much of a conflict between different waves of migration. There is a bit more conflict within the new migration. So there's any Polish people who would cut their ties and networks with Polish people and just go straight into the society?
Well, I think you have, what you have to, that's an interesting question, because I've thought about this quite a lot, because my sample was set up in some ways to look for Polish people. And that's what I was interested in. People who wanted to speak the Polish language was what I was looking for, and to look at how they used language. But outside of that, and with it, and in groups of people that they know, there are people who have decided just that. They wouldn't be in my research, but they have made those decisions not to be involved at all. And but they're not just from recent economic migrants. There are, I've got examples in my research from the 1980s, and there's some of these tensions around who's Polish and who isn't Polish are sort of played out through those. So people who decide that this particular organised way of being Polish isn't for them, they were those groups of people even after the Second World War. So I've interviewed people sort of all over England who speak English, born in Poland, came after the war, speak English in their lives, and that's a conscious decision. They don't want to be part of it. There are also second generation children of people who were born in Poland who speak very fluent Polish and don't want anything to do with it. So there are all those kinds of decisions made. And it's one of the reasons why it's actually quite difficult to identify, even within, talking about the Polish community, it's a very complex group of people. Because even some of the ones, I did some research about the idea of Polish families. So people talk about English families and Polish families, but even within one family, I've got an example of a man who talks about he's been part of a Polish family, but when you talk to his daughters, no, they're not. They don't see themselves in that way. So, but another twist on this is, during the interviews, they'd explained to me that if somebody said something that was politically, it was offensive about Polish people, they suddenly became Polish. You know, because, and that's what I mean about, it depends who's asking and what they're asking for. And I think a lot of people who speak Polish who might not define themselves as Polish might have that sort of reaction.
Okay, well, I think we could probably continue the conversation and the comments for some time, but it is after 1 now.